distinguished gentleman with us named Robert Peace. Uh, is it Peace or Peas?
Peas, like the vegetable.
Peas. Yeah, it's
And I'm not
interesting.
sure how distinguished I am, so
Have you
that's
have
okay.
you had any relatives in Minnesota? Because
No,
I live literally 10 miles from a town named Pease.
there's lots of Peases out there. It's amazing. There's another Robert Pease that lives in the city I live in, which gets interesting
Oh, that
because
must be confusing.
he's
So
always
hopefully he.
wanted by, yeah, well, he's always
I,
wanted by the cops and
I
has a
was gonna
really
say,
bad credit rating. So,
hopefully it's misdemeanors and not felonies. So.
yeah.
That could get a little sticky. But anyways, Robert, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know that you're an IT guy and you've been in the business for a while, kind of like myself. But go ahead and kind of give us an overview of who you are, and a little technical, but then maybe talk about your experience in the not-for-profit world, because I think that's primarily where folks are interested in learning about today.
All right. Well, I'm self-taught, 100%, no college degree. Started in computers when I was 13. I'm 62 now, so that's been a while. I got a very unique opportunity when I was young to work in a data center with a teacher that really got me started in the computer world.
Hmm.
Got a pretty extensive background in phone systems also at the same time and kind of grew with all of that. For the last 24 years, I've been working for a nonprofit, family service agency, social service agency, and have really enjoyed that. Finally retired from that and have been retired a couple of years. So some of my information may be outdated. And of course, we won't talk politics, but with all the grants and stuff changing every day,
Hmm.
who knows where we're going to land. So I'm just going to play like it was 2 years ago and we'll see how that shakes out. Well, there's lots of grants available. There's obviously technology grants,
Hmm.
but for I worked for a Jewish organization, which
Hmm.
opened us up to all kinds of security grants from the federal government,
Hmm.
which also incorporated IT because I could upgrade IT infrastructure based on
Hmm.
security needs for
Hmm.
IP cameras, that sort of thing. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of
Hmm.
spill over there. My job with a nonprofit, I was the director of IT, facilities, transportation, safety, and security. And I was also in charge of the other duties department.
Yeah, others. Well, that's a pretty diverse group of assignments there. So
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
have to be an athletic individual to do that stuff. Um, so one of the question that I had and that I was kind of curious about is how did you learn about grant possibilities that were that were afforded? Did you have a source? Did they kind of fall on your desk, or how did you learn about those opportunities?
Well, my first foray into grant writing was with my transportation job, was with the Florida Department of Transportation, getting vehicles and things like that. That was an ongoing program before I got there. They had
Hmm.
been supplied vehicles through a federal and state grant. And that just kind of grew, learning how to do that kind of grew into finding other opportunities. I had some good people, some good
Hmm.
grantors that were very helpful in, because they understand the nonprofit world, not every nonprofit can afford a grant writer,
Hmm.
and um, they helped me a lot. So
Hmm.
don't be afraid to ask the person that's given the money for help writing the grant because they're,
Actually, that's a good um, good piece of advice. Like you can have contact with the people who are given the money and ask them questions, or how would you like to see this? How would you like to see that? How should we explain these things? And most times aren't they pretty willing to help?
oh yeah, yeah. And they prefer that because they're more likely to call you and tell you, hey, you missed this. Can you send it right away and we can get it in, other than just bypassing your
Yeah.
application and saying, forget it.
And I'll add this little piece of it. In my personal experience, I was a president of a 501(c)(3), so you're probably not super used to it in the South, but I was of a hockey association
Okay.
in Wisconsin. Um, but when you reach out to the folks who are giving you the grants, right, um, you become a human. all of a
Yes.
sudden, and you become a person, and all of a sudden, you make a couple phone calls to them, then maybe they call you. Now maybe when you're going through the grant writing process, you're a buddy. You're somebody who's a known quantity,
Right.
and it just becomes, the process becomes much more familiar, right?
Yes.
And I think that that's one of the intangibles that really, you can't, it's hard to quantify, but it's an important thing. If you just throw a document in, you just submit a document, it's pretty impersonal, and um, it's much more effective, I think, if you can put a face on who you are and what you're about and those types of things. And like I said, you become real. Did you find that in your processes that
Yes.
that was
Yes. Very,
helpful?
very, very much so. I developed personal relationships with the people that actually approved the grants, and they could tell me right away if I was barking up the wrong tree or something, just from a
Mhm.
conversation on the phone. So I wasn't wasting my time. The DOT grants were sometimes 200 to 300 pages long. They were amazing, the documentation they want. And to have somebody there that you can call and say, hey, on this part of the application, I mean, the application is only like 20 pages long, but when you add all the supporting documentation, you got to make sure you get it right for those
Right,
things.
right.
So,
I want to just call attention to real quick. Paul put out there in the chat a source for grant information, grants that are available and stuff. So if you want to check out the chat, there's a link out there that Paul threw in there for reference. So I just wanted to call that out because sometimes we miss what happens in the chat, but I'm incredibly alert, so I saw it. No, I saw it, and so just so everybody knows that that's out there. Um, how like in the process of kind of vetting out or deciding on grants, did you find that certain grants or certain grantors maybe were a good fit for you culturally, certain other ones not? Did that piece kind of fit into it? You mentioned that you had worked for a Jewish organization, and were maybe some out there that were available or specialized in that space, or what did you find in that regard?
there are some that are specialized. I didn't have a lot to do with those. They were really program grants and things, other than events, things
Hmm.
that got funding for events I'd get involved in.
Hmm.
But really, what I found was talking to our directors
Hmm.
who are talking to the people who sponsor their programs. You all of a sudden, you may say to the director, hey, if you guys had better laptops, you guys could do so much more. And they agree with that. And I said, well, why don't you ask your grant person, your donor,
Hmm.
um, if they'd be interested in, sponsoring some of that or writing a grant for, giving us some money for that, basically. Um, it's always interesting. The answer is always no if you don't ask.
Right,
And one thing I learned working there was if you ask, the worst they can say is no.
right,
So, you
right,
never know where you can spot opportunities.
right.
Um, and having good relationships with the people that run the programs is good because we found out about one of our technology grants from the director of our Mentoring for Kids program, Boys and
Hmm.
Girls essentially program. Um, they were given $15,000 a year for back office IT upgrades because they understood if your back office didn't work, your front office didn't work.
Hmm.
So we would use that. We funded a massive upgrade from straight servers. I had 5 servers. We went to VMware at the time
Hmm.
and did a $45,000 project because United Way, who is funding the Big Brothers Big Sisters, gave us $15,000, which I called seed money. And then
Hmm.
I went to the board and said, they're going to give us, 30-40% of the cost to do this. We really need to do this. And it turned
So
into
you
more funding from internal too.
so you found that other than your own expertise and experience with it, that people inside the organizations a lot of times had exposure to grant sources and possible avenues for that. So, I have a recent or a past example for me was as a hockey association part of a community. Actually, there was availability for a community development block grant that came through a municipality versus me doing it directly, but I was able to help and participate in that. So sometimes thinking about your business or your organization in a little bit different way can expose you to different avenues for the ability to get some grants. Like I said,
Right.
we previously um, we had never contemplated partnering with the municipality. The town in Wisconsin. I was living in Wisconsin at the time. It's called the Wisconsin Towns Association, but they helped us. We also had a disaster. We had a tornado come through and it leveled our facility, but we were able to use our contacts from that to get grants to rebuild our facility and rebuild our program and really come back better than before. But it was from those partnerships and those other sources that we maybe had to thought of before, to give us those new and kind of previously untapped revenue streams.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Money can lead to money.
Right.
In
Right.
an odd twist, when we got our DOT grants, which were vehicles, which are
Mm-hmm.
$250,000 grants to buy
Mm-hmm.
vehicles,
Mm-hmm.
we got state pricing. We got authorized to get state pricing through the vehicle vendors.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of things happened there. I was talking to Verizon one day, talking to my salesperson. I said, we're under the state contract with to buy vehicles through the state. They said, oh, you're in the state contract. We can put you on the state contract with Verizon.
Mm-hmm.
Once you're on one, you can be on the other.
Right.
Our bills were $700-800 a month because we had to have a phone in every single van. The state contract was $30 a month, unlimited service, no cost for the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And we went from $700 a month to about $120 a month just by switching to the state
Yeah.
contracts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How often is it though? How often does that happen where it kind of cascades? You're part of one thing and then you share a little bit of information and two other things happen, that can really help you out.
it
Um,
happens a lot. Yeah.
I guess one of the things about our session today is I'd like to be sensitive and aware of the people who are on it. If you have any questions, feel free to jump in at any time. And does anybody have any question now? Because I know this is a topic that has generated interest. So if anybody has any questions, I want to make sure that if you do, we're answering those. So does anybody have any questions right now that they'd like to ask Rob to make sure we get covered? Hearing nothing, we'll plow forward
Yep.
with that. Um, um, I guess one of the things that is how about eligibility requirements? I mean, I have to assume that you ran into that with different things. Do you find a common slate of eligibility requirements, or do you think that it's different from place to place and from grant to grant, and you just really need to be aware of that?
Well, a lot in the, at least down in Florida, a lot of the nonprofit grants, they set a cutoff at either a million or about $3 million budget for some grants.
Hmm.
Some grants don't care. And some grants say, if you make this is for people under $1 million. There's also eligibility for a lot of grants. You can't be, unless you're getting a faith-based grant, you can't be a church, a
Hmm.
library, or a school because those are all funded under other areas typically. So
Hmm.
that's an eligibility requirement we run into. And let me say, being a faith-based organization is not the same as being a church. As long as you don't discriminate or you offer services to everybody,
Hmm.
you can go for that grant. That
Right.
grant is available to you, even though you're faith-based. Now, sometimes you have to make the case that the money you're getting for the grant is for everyone, not just.
Hmm.
And, in some of your questions you asked me earlier was, about how do I write grants and how do I structure grants? I'm really cognizant of what they're looking for. If one of their big requirements is that you are not a church and you do not, you know, deal with only one religion or one type of people, I make sure in the wording I don't ever give them the impression of that. As a matter of
Hmm.
fact, I go out of the way to explain that we help everybody.
Right. Well, and it seems that that kind of fits hand in glove with the need to, or the benefits of being in touch with those
Yes.
grantors, and having that line of communication. Um, you know, uh, that just it reinforces that it's an important thing. Um, as you went through as you stepped through your career, think back across your, I don't want to say career writing grants, but your period writing grants, like, were there common requirements or common documentations that, like, everybody wants this or everybody wants that, or can you share a little bit of that about are there specific pieces of documentation that are important for grant writing?
So everybody wants finances. They want some financial, a 990 or whatever. They want some sort of, or know that an audit's been done. The main reason being they want to make sure that their money isn't getting thrown away.
Hmm.
Meaning you're going to get this big grant, you're going to go out of business next year.
Right.
So that's the one thing. They seem to always want to know if you're getting a capital grant that has maintenance requirements or something after the purchase.
Hmm.
They want to know that you've planned for that, you've budgeted for it. They want to know that you're going to be able to support what you're buying and keep
Hmm.
going.
The tracking of the expenditures seems like that would be an important thing. I mean, how do you, I mean, in general, I know all of them are different, but in general, can you just say, well, I bought an e-bike, or do you need to, like, keep the invoice, the documentation, those types of things provided as part of a packet in the event of an audit?
We keep that information for auditing purposes. Most of the grantors, especially the smaller grantors, want to report within a year. The United Way was big on this. They want to
Hmm.
report within a year saying, did you meet your project goals and how is the money you spent, how is it affecting the agency?
Hmm.
And that goes back to grant writing. If you're going to, if they're requiring that you show what you did with the money, then when you write your next grant for the next grant cycle, incorporate how you spent the money in the last one
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
try to tie them together. This is furthering the mission of helping seniors or whatever.
Right. And I would imagine that you need to be able to document or show that the money received for a specific thing went for that thing.
Yes,
So in other words, if you had grant money for a playground or for athletic equipment, you didn't spend it on pop machines or
right,
something like
right,
that,
right,
right?
right.
Right.
Yeah, like DOT grants require that you pay a percentage of the cost, and then you pay 10% of the cost of a vehicle,
Hmm.
which is great. I mean, when you look at the money there, that's
Right.
incredible. Um, so you have to send them a copy of the check that you wrote to pay the vendor for your
Okay.
10%, and then they pay the rest directly. Um, United Way grants weren't that bad. Some of the other grants aren't that bad. They're making an assumption that you're doing what you say you do, but you got to keep the documentation for audit purposes.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah, I think that that's an important assumption, is that you're going to have to show a trail at some point of what's
right.
happening. So having being able to track that is very important. And again, with the communicating with them, understanding what they want ahead of time for tracking
Right,
is
right.
also very important. And I suppose there's different requirements between whether it's a government grant or a private source things. I would imagine that if you're getting something from the state of whatever, I guess state of Florida in this case, versus the what is it, the Bill and what was it, Bill and Nancy Gates Foundation?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're those would be two different sets of requirements, and being probably painfully aware of those is important.
Yes. Yes.
Because
Also, well,
oh,
I
go
was
ahead.
going to say, um, if you can get a hold of other people that have gotten these grants in the past and talk to them
Oh, that's a great idea.
in a similar manner. One of the things DOT does is every year for the kickoff for the next grant cycle, they have a meeting in Fort Lauderdale, which is an hour and a half drive for me, but it's worth going because I get to meet other people and talk about how they work
Hmm.
things to.
I think I should start
Make it
writing
work for
grants in
them.
Florida, so I have to take a trip to Fort Lauderdale. That
Well,
sounds pretty good in the middle of January when it's 20 below here in Minnesota. I think
yep.
that's a great idea.
Or you can come down here in August when it's 95. Well, I should say in May when it's 95 today and,
Yeah, no, thank you.
100% humidity.
I'm a little bit thick for that stuff. 90 degrees today in Minnesota, and then 48 for the high on Friday.
Oh, yeah.
So
Nice.
we love the weather here. So, switching gears a little bit, what do you think makes a compelling grant proposal? What do you think kind of is there a little salesmanship involved in the process of writing grants, or what do you think about that?
Yes. Short answer is yes, there is.
Yeah,
Um, Really, you got to know your audience.
right.
Go on their website, look what kind of, things they're doing, what their interests are. And if, the interesting thing about IT grants that I did a lot of was it crosses literally all of the boundaries. Everybody needs IT for something.
Hmm.
So when you're writing your grant proposal, right up in the beginning, say, we do this and we want to do it better. And we need this much money to do it better for this equipment. And this is how it's going to make it better.
Hmm.
And if you can write
Hmm.
that in a quick paragraph right at the beginning, that gets their attention and keeps them reading.
Right,
It's like the
right,
first page of the book has got to be good because it's got to
right.
get their attention.
Another thing I wanted to ask you, and you're and you- maybe I don't know if you've had much time to contemplate it, but what do you think the impact of things like Chat GPT and those types of tools have been on grant writing? I'm just kind of curious about that a little bit.
Well, it has the potential to be huge,
Hmm.
but it's also easily picked up.
Hmm.
I can envision me writing a grant with ChatGPT, sending it to the United Way, and then throwing it at ChatGPT and saying, "Did they use ChatGPT to write this?" You
Right,
know,
right, yeah, yeah,
because it all of a sudden becomes you see if you've read enough grants, you know which ones were written personally,
right,
which ones were written by the bean counters,
right.
which ones were written by ChatGPT. You know?
Yeah, I always like to make my stuff not too perfect, so I got to throw in a few mistakes. It's I always do that on purpose just to throw them off, right?
Now we all know. Yep. Yep.
I think that they're like one of the things is I think you're correct and very very rightly stated that there's not a replacement for a human creating something, right? I mean theoretically there is, but a human being behind that pen or word processor is an important thing. I think that it occurs to me that a tool like ChatGPT or Copilot or those um, are powerful as a reference tool,
Yes.
right? You can help pull together information. It seems to be very good about pulling information, but at the end of the day, I think the most advisable thing is to still have a human creating the content, if
Yep.
that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. And it's like the ChatGPT is like the encyclopedia of the newspaper.
Hmm.
I treat it like a 5-year-old child who has access to unlimited information. It has ADD. It goes off on tangents sometimes. You have to kind of keep it concentrate in the right direction. Don't get me
Right.
wrong. I use ChatGPT literally every day. I have a pro subscription to it because I use it so much.
Hmm.
I use it for helping me with 3D printing problems, working out RF design stuff, just some hobby things I do. I use it
Right.
for writing code and things like that
Oh,
too. But
you should never have said that you do 3D printing. So now I'm
uh,
going to have to talk to you about 3D printing offline.
if you listen closely, you'll hear my printer running in the background. It's printing a
Nice.
case for something right at the moment.
Very
So,
nice.
yeah.
How important do you think the ability to weave a good story is when writing a grant application or filling out a grant paperwork?
Well, let's, like you said, we'll put it in two different classes. When you're writing a grant proposal to an individual or a small foundation, it's very, very important. When you are writing An application to a big government entity or a huge foundation, not so much. They just want the facts. You know, it just occurred to me that writing a grant proposal's kind of like filling out a resume.
Hmm.
You really have
Yeah.
to target it towards who it's going to, and do they want the facts or do they want to know about your life? If you're trying to
Right.
get hired by a science company, they want to know the facts. If you're trying to get hired by a social service agency, they want your life experiences.
That's a good point. I think, and that's a great comparison because like with resumes, it it, it isn't a one size fits all type of a thing.
Oh,
You have to be targeted in that. And I think that that's a very important thing to understand with the grant writing piece of it as well.
well, another parallel there is a lot of these grants that you submit to these large foundations are done by a checklist. And if you don't
Hmm.
have a checklist, you don't make it to the next step. If you don't have something in that checklist, you don't make it to the next step. So that's the other thing I'd say is really, really important. Make sure you know what that checklist is and you hit every single point somehow.
Right.
And don't bury them. Make them obvious.
Right.
You know, this does
That's a
this
good
for
point.
that reason. Get them out front, bold them if you have
Yeah.
to, just because the first thing people do when they get an application like that is they scan it for the specific things they're looking
Right.
for.
Right.
And if you format it in such a way that really highlights the bullet points they want to know, you've got a better chance of getting
Right.
through that first stage.
And that probably is an important thing for us to think about in our modern world today, and that is, you know, I can take a document and I can put it into, let's just say, Copilot, right? And I
Yeah,
can say, analyze this, or tell me if this includes points about this, this, and this. And you got to think that somebody who's reviewing, multiple grant application could be doing the same thing. And if
absolutely.
they analyze it or score it somehow, and those important pieces of their application aren't included in it, um, yeah, you're probably going to get bounced,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, you and I talked about using AI. I'm sure they're using AI. And that's you train your AI
Hmm.
bot to look for specific things and then you throw documents at it and it comes back and says yes or no.
Right, right. And for those of us who hire or have to hire people, I just had a case this last week where um, looked at a resume. The job requirement was for Hyper-V, Cisco networking, and just some very specific things. And on the resume, which got bounced by the human resources group, was virtualization and networking experience. But they didn't
Right.
say Hyper-V and they didn't say
Right.
Cisco. They didn't have those things listed. So the resume actually got bounced. So I think it is important and probably doubly important now to make sure that you're hitting all the bullet points for the grants. You're making sure that that's covered.
Now, don't get too nerdy and put like keywords right at the top and try to hide them. So
Right.
HTML
Right.
tags don't work so well in there
Yeah, right. Yeah,
with the document.
you can over nerd things sometimes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
um, I guess I'll take a quick little break here and ask if anybody has any questions or comments or thoughts. Hearing none, I'll marshal forward. One of the things I was wondering about is um, relative to budgeting, budgeting when you're doing a grant. I mean, is it important to include a budget? Is it important to include budget information when you're applying for a grant, or is that something that if they need it, they'll ask for it, or would you put a kind of a proposed budget together and include it with the process?
Yeah. Budget for the project or a budget for the company?
Budget for the project.
Yes, absolutely. Put a budget in. They want to know numbers right away.
Hmm.
And along those lines, when you're budgeting a project,
Hmm.
I'll say don't be afraid to, and actually it's not a bad thing to overshoot the grant amount. So if
Hmm.
they're giving you a grant amount for $15,000, shoot for 16,000 and tell them you're going to cover the difference. That has a couple of advantages. It lets them know you're putting some skin in the game. It's not
Hmm.
all the grant writer. It lets them know that you have the ability to to fund those kind of things. Of course, you have to include how you're going to fund the difference. The other thing
Mhm.
is sometimes it reduces the reporting requirements when you get to the end and they want to know if you used all the money. So, well, yeah, we used all the money. There was no chance that we were going to use less because we're going to put in whatever the difference is. We knew we were going to go over. That's kind of been my experience. If I had a $15,000 grant I put in for $14,000, they started wanting to know if I spent all the money or not. But if I put in $16,000, they never asked.
Right. Right.
You know.
That's a very good point.
Yep.
Um,
And you
I'm
can
gonna ask it.
overshoot like by a lot, like I did with our VMware
Mhm.
proposal. It's $50,000 project with $15,000 up front. For the grant. And I showed the $50,000 in the budget proposal for the grant and said, here's how I'm going to fund the rest of it through
Mhm.
other donations and other lenders and that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So
And I suppose depending on what it is, that the concept of gap funding becomes important, or documentation of the gap funding becomes important.
yes, they want to make sure you can do it.
They want to make sure you can do it. They don't want to. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to ask this question. It's a little bit weird. Probably it seems maybe more weird than it is. Well, not weird, but maybe out of the norm. So, is there a grant rating season? Is there a grant eligibility season? I mean, is there
Not really.
seasonality to it?
I didn't. I mean, when you're dealing with government grants, yes, you're going with
Right.
fiscal years and things like
Right.
that.
Right.
Um, but not really. They're like the United Way grant rolled every quarter.
Hmm. Hmm.
They had a new grant cycle. You can only apply for one a year, but
Right. So there
uh,
likely is a business cycle involved with it, but it's not, like you don't have to like by April have so many grants done, or you know, they're out of money for the year.
no, I never really ran into those. That goes back to one of the other questions you asked, and the answer to that was get your grant in early, like not at the deadline, as early as you can. The sooner you get it in, the better. The more chance they have to ask you questions
Right.
if they have questions.
Right.
Some grants won't start reviewing till the deadline. Some will,
Right.
just especially if you have relationships with people, that helps a lot too.
Right. Right.
So,
Um, so I have a couple questions on like tracking grants. And so let's say I submit the grant application. Is there a certain amount of time that I should wait or be sensitive to before I reach out to them, or is it a good practice to maybe give it a couple of days and reach out, or a couple of weeks or something like that? Is there a communication cadence that makes sense? When kind of and when you're in the waiting mode to hear about the results of a grant application?
um, depends upon the size of the grantor. Again, if you're asking for
Right,
$250,000 from DOT,
right.
that process, you put in the grant application, and a year and a half later, you show up with the vehicles. You find out about 9 months later if you're going to get them or
Hmm.
not.
Hmm.
Um,
And I suppose
Smaller
you
one,
want to seem engaged and not annoying,
yes, definitely.
right?
Smaller ones, that goes back to a relationship with them.
Hmm.
Ask them up front. When should I, ask what's going on? When is your decision making process? I don't want to be a pest, but I don't want to get forgotten. And I don't want to be waiting for something I'm not going to get.
Right.
So when should I ping you back? Then put that in your calendar, get the person's name, call them
Hmm.
directly, say, "Hi, Mary, it's Rob calling you again. How are we doing?"
Right.
You
Right.
know,
Um, which this probably seems self-evident, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. Is it ever a good idea to throw a temper tantrum if you don't receive a grant?
no, nope.
um, in my experience, doing such, and I've known organizations, mostly not my past hockey career, but who have done that and really put a stink on themselves,
Oh yeah, yeah.
which,
There are blacklists.
yeah, thus guaranteeing they will never get funded from that source again,
Or get funded from other sources.
or from others,
See,
because they talk, right?
yeah, I mean, they talk a lot. and you you get a reputation in the industry after a while if you've been doing it, you know,
Right.
whether your grants are going to come in. I go back to the United Way because it was the one I did every single year and I got the most feedback on. I never got rejected. I always got it approved. I struggled the first few years getting it right and
Mm-hmm.
finding out because they're not tech nerds. They
Mm-hmm.
say they want a technology plan. I'm like, well, what do you mean by a technology plan? Stuff changes every month. How am I supposed to
Right.
plan out 5 years? And what I learned was best guess doesn't have to be right, just that
Right.
you've got an idea where you're going. But it got to the point where I did a grant for another nonprofit for the same for did a grant from the United Way for another nonprofit that had been struggling, had applied 5 times and never got this United Way grant. Um, and I got a phone call when I submitted the grant for them. I wrote it, submitted it for them, and the grant person, grantor, asked, did you write this grant? I said, yes. Did you do all the technical work on it? Yes. Okay, no problem. And a week later, they got a check because they had a reputation, or I had a reputation with them that I didn't mess around. I knew what they needed. I knew how to report to them. So, but the exact opposite is true.
Right.
Not getting too crazy about it, but if you blow up one grant, you could be blowing up other grants that are connected to it. Uh,
Right.
United Way is a perfect case. If for some reason we messed up our Mentoring for Kids program, we would lose our United Way grant also. We mess up our DOT grant, we lose all of our vehicles, and we lose all of our Verizon benefits and several other companies that have state contracts. You really got to be cognizant of that. So always, be a good guy, be gracious. Thanks. Maybe next year, ask them what you did wrong.
Right. Right.
You know,
Um, right. I think, and I was gonna ask you
sorry.
like if there's ways to kind of, I don't want to say guarantee, but enhance your chances. And I think that we talked about that with the relationship building and just kind of, being that affable character.
It's
Um,
like it's like voting. Vote early, vote often.
right. Right. And I think, and it occurs to me, and kind of listening to the things you say, that writing a grant, especially because we're both technology people, and I think that you know, technology people can talk to technology people, but normal humans don't want to talk about their technology.
Right.
And I think that kind of stripes through the whole thing in that be empathetic and aware of the other person's point of view or their understanding, right? So
Yes.
it helps to write a technology grant in English, not ones and zeros, right? So just be aware, no matter what it is, no matter what space you're in, if it's children or religious or abuse, those things, be aware of who's going to be reading it and your use of jargon and things that are industry specific. Maybe it applies, maybe it's a good thing, but I would say you should at least think about it to make sure that you're not, you know, um, using terms that people don't understand. I think you want to be as available and general as possible, right?
Right. We go back to how do you structure a grant proposal.
Hmm.
Your first page, if it isn't the application, your first page explaining things should be an executive summary.
Hmm.
Assuming you're writing it to the CEO who knows absolutely nothing about what you're talking about. And then get more technical as you get towards the budget, because then you're listing specific equipment, and you have a section in there for the nerds that want to know. And if they want a technology plan, again, start out with an executive summary, but then that's where you can get really technical about how adding,
Right.
a different,
So, so
fiber
you
line
got
here is
you
going to,
got the boss, you got
yeah,
the nerds, you got the bean counters,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then you wrap a bow around it for the end, huh? Yeah,
that's
that's a
it.
good way to think about it.
Yeah.
Um, and we're getting a little bit close to our time here, so I want to
Okay.
make sure I ask this question from a planning perspective. Um, Going into a year or going into a fiscal year, do you have would you have it planned out, the grants that you're gonna go for? I would assume there's things that are known and things that are unknown. So do you map out throughout the year when you might be working on certain grants and when they're due, and
Yeah.
then, or is it just kind of a more of an ad hoc thing, and when it comes available, we want to take it, we want to jump on it and take advantage of it?
Um, it's good to be ahead of it. Like if you knew the United Way was coming and you knew in April you were up for it
Hmm.
again,
Hmm.
start working on that in January. Start
Hmm.
planning what you think you want to buy because it takes a while to get all the quotes together and come up with budgetary numbers, that sort of thing. Because that's the other thing. United Way grants wanted to see the quotes. They wanted to
Right.
know. Um, DOT was again a year and a half. You knew when it was coming. There was a kickoff 3 months before the application open date was, and
Hmm.
um, that was always in like October, November kind of thing, and
Hmm.
uh, you
So
sort of knew.
did you find that in one year you might be laying the groundwork for activity you would be doing the next year?
Absolutely.
And did you, other than your own cunning, did you use any tools to help track that or help map that out, or did you just kind of make a mental note of it or put it on a calendar? How did you kind of understand what that topography was relative to the items that were out there and when they might have been due or when you could work on them?
Well, again, technology world versus transportation world. Transportation world's easy. You got a useful life of a vehicle. You know how many miles you do a year. You know where it's going to wear out. You need to start planning a year and a half ahead of that, so you kind of know what you got. Technology is kind of the same way. You know, you've got servers. Like we had a three host cluster in VMware, and I had it in a cycle where I had enough money in that grant to replace one of those servers every year. And that was an automatic. It was all part of the package. And if I had extra money left over, we bought switches or things like that. But
Hmm.
that's how I built that up to be, a really reliable, stable system. Same thing with, the storage arrays. They're getting towards the end of life. You replace them every 3, 4 years. So you fit that in that cycle.
Hmm.
And I had that cycle going for quite a few years and ended up, top of the line. We had all Dell high-end servers and compelling arrays,
Hmm.
so not bad for a small nonprofit. It's,
Right,
it's,
right.
you know,
So, as we kind of put a bow around the conversation, um, uh, how would you measure the success of your endeavors into grant management? How would you determine, hey, I'm doing all right, or hey, we got to improve some stuff? Do you have any advice on that? Just anecdotal.
well, your reporting is going to tell you.
Hmm.
I think that, I mean, the way I looked at it is the number of dollars I brought in a year. Everybody looks at the IT department as a straight cost, a straight expense. And if I can bring that expense down through grants, why not?
Right.
Everything I did was try to make them save money. I'll say one last thing too. If you're going to order something from a grant, get the best you can afford with the grant. Don't skimp.
Mm.
Perfect example. I ordered passenger vans. I could have gotten plain white 8 passenger vans, nothing special, nothing. I ordered them with premium paint, a color, not white. I ordered them with the Bose sound system, the trailer towing package, dual air conditioners, because DOT was going to pay for it. And part of DOT's deal was after 5 years or 100,000 miles, you own that vehicle and you can do what you want with it. That's past its useful life. Now its resale value is up. So when you think long term, when you're buying a server, even if you know you're going to replace it in 3 years, that server's still got value and could probably last you many more years as a backup system or resale. So don't be afraid to pitch for it. Last thing I'll say, because I know we're getting late, but I wanted to make this point. You asked a question about operating expenses in your questions
Hmm.
here. Most grants will not pay for operating expenses because they're kind of an unknown and they go on forever. The way I got around that was I got vendors to sell me equipment with service built in. When you buy Dell
Oh.
servers, get the longest amount of warranty you can get.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, Another company I used for GPS tracking for the vehicles, they said we don't sell the boxes, we sell the service. I said, well, I need you to sell me a box with 5 years of service because that's a useful life.
Mhm.
I need you to come up with a price. And they did. And I sent it to DOT as a capital expense.
Mhm.
I'm buying the box with 5 years of service. And they went for it. They paid for it.
Cool. Good. So yeah, one of my last questions was, and you just answered it, a couple of best practices, and I think one of those is contemplating capital projects versus operational, and um, the concept of if you can fold that operational expense in there, that's a good tip right there.
Always ask if a company
Pro
wants
tip.
to make a sale, they'll do it.
Yeah, pro tip. That's all right.
And
Very
the
good.
GPS company said they'd never done that before, but they were happy to. They love getting the money up front.
It'd be
So
interesting to know if they'd done it for any other ones after that.
I
After
don't know.
after you cover that's very creative. Very good. Before we go, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Rob? Going,
I'm
going.
either really good or really bad.
Yeah, we either did really good or really bad.
Yeah.
My mouth is tired, so we probably talked a lot.
Yeah.
So
They're all
yeah,
sleeping.
yeah. Um, what I will throw out there, and I guess I can put it in the chat, is that if anybody has any questions, uh, my email is in the chat. It's Keith Keith at netvpro.com. You have any questions, you can get a hold of me, and I'll relay it to Bob, and we can get those answered for you. So, um, Bob, Rob, thank you very much for your time today.
No problem.
Super informative. Like I said, in my experience, I've been in 501c3s and done different things, and you provided some good information, very good information. So, thank you, and I learned a bunch from you.
Well,
So
that's good.
again, check out our YouTube channel. Give me a day to get everything edited and get out there, but we'll put this up on our YouTube channel, and you can, like I said, any questions, feel free to email me at any time.